Hello and welcome to Ukraine in Flames, a special project brought to you by Ukraine Crisis Media Center, Ukraine Catholic University's Analytical Center, and NGO Euro-Atlantic Course. My name is Alexandra Tsekhanovska. I'm the head of Hybrid Warfare Analytical Group at Ukraine Crisis Media Center, and today we will be talking about the notorious Russian propaganda and how it works during the war. If you want to learn more, please subscribe to our channel to stay tuned. When it comes to disinformation, Russia has been an unchallenged champion in this field. Establishing its first disinformation unit in the secret services as early as 1923, it has a very dark tradition of weaponizing information. This process is consistent and not dependent on the state of relations with the targeted society or country. Yet with the large-scale invasion of Ukraine, Russia was bound to make some changes. So we discussed briefly the key characteristics of Russian wartime disinformation and propaganda, what key audiences it targets, and how the Russian proxies behave in the changing circumstances. We talked to David Stulik, senior analyst at European Value Center for Security Policy, Irina Eichelson, PhD in social psychology and conflict psychologist, Vitaly Rybak, chief analyst at Internews Ukraine, Olena Churanova, fact-checker at Stop Fake Organization, Romano Sachuk, research assistant at Digital Forensic Research Lab, and Ksenia Iluk, an analyst at Detector Media NGO. And we start with David Stulik, a brilliant expert and a good friend of Ukraine, who brings us the first-hand experience and expertise on how Russian disinformation targets the West and what are the differences of its influence in the various regions of Europe.
Well, what we've noticed is that Russian propaganda is targeting different societies in Europe in a different way. For example, here in Central Europe, Russian message is that it is Ukraine and Ukrainian forces that commit all these atrocities. They are not so widespread as they are, for example, in such countries like France, Germany. I mean, the countries that are farther from Ukraine than Central European countries. So here, the more attention is paid by Russian propagandists and their proxies on, for example, portraying Ukrainian refugees as people who don't actually need any assistance, people who are not appreciating the level of hospitality they received. Also, they are being described in such a way that they are actually responsible for the increase of prices. And this is something that Russian proxies or Russian agents of influence are using quite widely, increasing prices for electricity, gas, petrol. They are linking it with the Ukrainian conflict. So in that kind of a way of presenting it, we should be kind of angry at Ukrainians that they caused this war, and now the Central European societies are paying the price, basically the increased prices for all these energy resources and commodities. This is something that is not so present in Western Europe, because the farther you are from Ukraine, you have a lower degree of reflecting these things. You have a smaller amount of information about what's going on in Ukraine. You just see these pictures on the TV. And when I, for example, follow German TV, often I'm kind of amused at how even German TV stations are presenting the atrocities, these war crimes from Bucha, in a way they say allegedly the crimes were committed by Russian troops. So it always leaves a certain degree of uncertainty that people then may have. And this is something that Russian propaganda is misusing and abusing. They just play and then kind of build their narratives on this uncertainty of the Western audiences. So these are, I would say, major distinctions that Russian propaganda is using and targeting in different European countries. Also, Russian propaganda and Russian narratives are trying to create a psychological pressure on different European societies. Indeed, let's say Western European societies, Germans, Belgians, French, are very much afraid of the escalation of the war. So the message from Russian propagandists to these societies is, if you are helping Ukraine, you will be driven into a war, then your country will be in a war with us. And this is something that is kind of a red line, at least in Germany, at least in France, Belgium, the Netherlands. The societies there do not want to be involved in a war. And they respectively put a pressure on their political elites. The pressure is like, we shouldn't help so much to Ukraine. And if we do, then yeah, we are risking a war. And this is something different in Central Europe because we are more aware that this is also war for us, on our behalf, that it's not only Ukraine's war, it's also our war. And there are large parts of societies here that are putting an opposite pressure on the governments. Namely, we should put more assistance, we should provide Ukraine with more weapons, with more deliveries of these materials, because Ukrainians are fighting also on our behalf.
Our next guest is Irina Ehelson, a PhD in social psychology and a conflict psychologist who explores the other key audiences targeted by the Kremlin in its media war machine. And she also talks about psychological operations in these challenging times.
Dozens of papers have been published on Russian propaganda over the last 20 years. So let me draw your attention to the latest developments that I will try to classify shortly by its audiences and leverages. Russian propaganda about current Russian invasion to Ukraine has various audiences. First of all, it's Ukrainian population. In Russian propaganda, look at the specific for those citizens on the recently occupied territories. Its aim is to break resistance of Ukrainians. The second audience is Russian own population. The aim is to gain support for war as a mean of Kremlin policy towards Ukraine. And in terms of Kremlin, the policy is that Ukraine should be destroyed as an independent country. Another reason is to cut off the public, Russian public, from uncomfortable truth about the role of Russian army in this war. The third population, the third audience, is politicians and people in the countries, and not only in the other countries, and not only in Western ones. At least in order to minimize their support to Ukraine, but ideally to enlist support in justification of the invasion with a strategic aim to spread Russian control over the whole region of the so-called Russian interests or zone of control. By the leverages, the propaganda influence uses various objects. First of all, this is misinterpretation of facts or creating of alternative facts or events. Like the video of allegedly beaten 16-year-old boy for communication in Russian by Ukrainians. This video and this fake was disproved by Bonn police as of 21st of March. Secondly, Russians are being told that Russian soldiers are extremely careful about preserving Ukrainian civilian life, that they are being greeted as liberators, that everybody wants to live under Russian rule, and that there are no civilian casualties on the Ukrainian side. I will not speak about Bucha and Gostomel and Mariupol, but Russia and Russian propaganda tries to create a picture of such support on occupied territories. And these videos, the so-called greeting of liberators, have no base in reality. Secondly, within misinterpretation of facts, this is also manipulation with interpretation. For example, Russian propaganda accused the United States for maintaining more than 30 laboratories of biological weapons in Ukraine. In fact, there were some regular scientific laboratories for the research of various diseases and pathogens that in fact cannot be used for any kind of weapon. Another object and another means is an influence on psychological states or ways of thinking. Of course, we can talk about psychological operations, and examples could be found in Kherson region, in occupied territories, where Russians have blocked Ukrainian cell phone networks and media. And they use various means and various forms of propaganda, providing distorted picture of the situation at the front line, about Ukrainian government plans toward the region, etc. Another way of Russian propaganda influencing to the way of thinking is manipulation with notions or meanings or history in order to broad Kremlin explanation of the Russian policy towards Ukraine. Of course, this is an incomplete list of the means of propaganda, and this list can be expanded. And I'm sure that this will be done by future researchers of this phenomenon, Russian propaganda.
We have also talked to Vitaly Rybak, a chief analyst at Internews Ukraine, who explains how Russia tries to negate the effects of war on its image and how it used propaganda to prepare the domestic audience for the large-scale invasion and much more.
Prior to speaking about Russian disinformation, one should remember that Russia has always seen information warfare as part of hybrid warfare against Ukraine and against the West. So understandably, since the beginning of the war, Russia has extensively used information as a weapon, just as well, to support its advancing troops and to, well, maybe in some way negate the influence of war in Ukraine on Russia's public image on the international arena. But make no mistake, disinformation narratives have helped the Kremlin to prepare domestic audiences for the invasion and also have stalled Ukraine's progress in its European and Euro-Atlantic integration. Because for the last 8 years, Russians have also tricked the West into thinking they could be reasoned with. Hence, nobody really expected that Vladimir Putin would be so crazy as to really execute his plan to attack Ukraine. And since the beginning of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, Kremlin propaganda has basically created a parallel reality. And in this reality, the Russian army is liberating Ukraine from Nazis, striking only at military targets, and being met by Ukrainians happy to become a part of the Russian world. The reality of what has been happening in Ukraine for the last 47 days couldn't be more far from this image Russian propaganda has been describing. Thankfully, from what we see, Russian narratives do not work well in the West. So, of course, Russia has been trying to use fringe media such as Zero Hedge to reach out to conspiracy theorists, those who have been Russia supporters for years, maybe to some marginal parts of the population. Still, in the majority, from what we see, Western audiences do not believe in what Russia has been saying. And the most important part is that the Western governments do not believe in what Russia says. And we also see that they are now treating information very seriously because, for instance, chief Russian propagandists such as Vladimir Solovyov, Margarita Simonyan, and others were also included in the EU sanction lists, along with those who were directly responsible for the invasion, because these propagandists are responsible for the invasion just as well. Still, Russians target other areas of the world. For instance, BRICS countries have become goals of an extensive Russian disinformation campaign. Russia uses its resources in such countries as Brazil, South Africa, India, China to promote its narrative that Russia was pushed to attack Ukraine, that Russia had to defend its own interests, and so on. Still, that is the sad reality. In these countries, these narratives do work. Also, some narratives do work in the West still. For instance, Marina Ovsyannikova has become a correspondent for Russia and Ukraine at Die Welt. And that made me speechless, because I totally disagree that Marina Ovsyannikova did anything courageous on state TV. Please mind that she has worked as an editor at Pathway TV channel for years, and this channel is known for spreading the Kremlin propaganda which has dehumanized Ukrainians for years and prepared Russian audiences for this war. Hence, Marina Ovsyannikova is directly responsible for the fact that Russia has recently turned into a totalitarian state that is increasingly closing itself off from the outside world. And also for all these atrocities which have been taking place in Bucha, Mariupol, and sadly countless other cities and towns in Ukraine, Marina Ovsyannikova is also directly responsible for that. So does her performance, even if it was sincere, does it redeem her work for Putin's propaganda machine? I do not.
We have a fact checker from Stop Fake, Olena Chiranova, today with us, who discusses Russian attempts to deal with losing the information war, fake fact checking as a trend, and key directions of Russian lies about the war, as well as other issues.
What changes do we see in Russian information tactics right now in Russian propaganda? Actually, it's a fact that they know that they are losing this information war right now. Therefore, of course, we are seeing that they close all the opportunities for their own citizens to get some other information about events in Ukraine, about war in Ukraine. And they only left these facts, so-called facts, that couldn't discredit Russian army. But of course, we know that these so-called facts is actually a lie. And they are lying a lot, and they are lying about their losses. They are lying about war crimes that they are committing here in Ukraine. And if we talk about the other audience, not Russians, but Ukrainians, about foreigners, Ukrainians, they are trying to reach through the same Telegram, for example, then Russia is trying to sow distrust, and they are trying to actively raise doubts about all the information that are coming even from official sources in Ukraine. And they are doing it, for example, through creating dozens of pseudo-fact-checking projects, pseudo-fact-checking Telegram channels, where they are saying that they are debunk fakes, but in reality, they just spread more lies about events in Ukraine, about this war, and they actually spread disinformation. In such situation, in such information space, you just understand that you can't trust anyone. And even if you see a Russian tank that is shooting to unarmed woman on a bicycle, and even if you have all hard facts that are proving that it was Russian tanks, still you can't believe that it was Russian tanks. And at the moment, Russian propaganda actually is a clear visualization of Orwell books, when the war is a peace and peace is a war, when black is white, and vice versa. So in such information chaos, in such space where the number of fakes, of Russian fakes, is really outrageous, it's really important to keep information silence, to maintain information calmness, and to read and spread only those information that was verified, that has been verified by professional fact checkers, by official sources, and by responsible media.
Our next speaker, Romano Sachuk, a research assistant at Digital Forensic Research Lab, further addresses some of the issues exploited by the Russian disinformation. For example, how it relies on the popular conspiracy theories resources in the US. He also talks about the new visual symbols as part of Russian propaganda and some of the dissemination mechanisms that Russia applies on social media.
Доброго дня. З приводу того, як Росія змінила свою тактику, я б сказав, що вони використовують як старі свої методи, в своїй пропагандистській діяльності, так і нові. Щодо старих, вони досить активно використовують наративи, які вже були розбиті, я не знаю, роками. Це ті самі біолабораторії, які несподівано злетіли, наприклад, у Сполучених Штатах у певних конспірологічних групах, або про нацизм в Україні, або про зовнішнє керування. Тобто це всі ті речі, які вже розбивалися роками, вони продовжують на них давити і вважати, що це досі працює, або когось може переконати, можливо, для внутрішньої своєї аудиторії. Друге, вони продовжують надавати десятки версій своїх подій, щоб виправдати дії своїх військових, або заперечити реальність. Як це було, наприклад, в Бучі з відео, де нібито тіла загиблих рухають руками або намагаються сісти тощо. Да, ми такі речі вже бачили з MH17, з отруєнням Скрипалів, тобто коли вони намагаються накидати якомога більше різних версій і таким чином розмити правду, щоб люди, які сильно не занурювалися, ніколи не змогли знайти або просто відмовитись від ідеї, знайти, що насправді сталося. Що ще цікаво, зі старого, це купівля блогерів. Наприклад, як було з Тіктоком, на початку березня там були відео, коли інфлюенсери почали знімати російські однакові відео з тим, що вони підтримують спеціальну операцію, тому що вона нібито за дітей Донбасу тощо, але текст був настільки однаковий, плюс з'явилися свідчення, що цим людям або деяким іншим блогерам пропонували це зробити, зняти подібні відео за 2000 рублів, тому, в принципі, воно само себе дискредитувало. Плюс, що ще цікаво, це промоція хештегів як I stand with Russia і I stand with Putin, тобто це хештеги у Твіттері, які трендилися у іспаномовному середовищі, у Індії та багатьох інших регіонах, тобто в основному не англомовних, і це все створювалося за допомогою неавтентичної поведінки, тобто так званих мереж для ретвітів, які підсилювали ці повідомлення і фактично робили так, що вони були більш помітними, тобто фактично вони грали з системою так, що кожен користувач теоретично міг бачити, що якийсь хештег є популярним, щоб створити цю ілюзію великої підтримки війни проти України. Щодо нових методів, тут треба відмітити цю нову, скажімо, візуальну комунікацію, яка прийшла до нас з цим витком ескалації 24 лютого. Це ось ці візуальні символи візі, які нанесені на військову техніку, які також використовуються активно пропагандою для того, щоб маркувати своїх і чужих, тобто акаунти, які маркуються з цими літерами, вони якби нібито в підтримку. Також дуже важливо зрозуміти, що дуже багато було і планових всіляких подій, непланових Російської Федерації. Щодо планових я маю на увазі, коли муніципальні установи, як то школи або бібліотеки, там вишукують своїх дітей, яких вони там навчають, і у формі літер ЗІ, наприклад, для того, щоб підтримати військових. По-друге, це більш пряма і нахабна комунікація державних діячів Російської Федерації, посольств та медіа, які виправдовують вбивства, побільше закликають до знищення України. Тут можна казати і про вже відому статтю РІА Новості на початку квітня, про ще одну статтю, яку спочатку опублікували 26 лютого, потім видалили, які виправдовують звірства і вбивства українців тощо. Ну і фінальна річ, напевно, найбільш цікавіша – це фальшивий факт-чекінг подій, які відбуваються зусиллями телеграм-каналу War and Fakes, а також його аналоговими вебсайтами, і те, як він поширюється. Поширюється він за допомогою офіційних акаунтів Російської Федерації, як то посольств, Міністерства оборони, у Твіттері та Телеграмі, для того, щоб показати, що Росія там чогось не робила, або це все українська пропаганда. Але знову ж таки, ці спроби досить недолугі, вони розбиваються осінт-ком'юніті, вони розбиваються фактчекерами, тому насправді ці речі не працюють на аудиторію, яка мислить критично, проте цілком ймовірно, що вони досить ефективні для російської внутрішньої аудиторії.
Last but not least, we have Ksenia Luk, an analyst from Detector Media Organization, who will brief us on what the Russian proxies have been up to in Ukraine, because Russian influence in the media field is not limited to just actors directly linked to the Kremlin, such as federal television. Local agents of influence have been a very important part of Russian information efforts. So let's find out how they have adapted to the circumstances of war and how they keep pushing Russian agenda when Ukrainian society is as united against it as ever.
With the Russian disinformation being the backbone of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, we at Detector Media are constantly monitoring Russian information operations in Ukraine. And in particularly, we focus on pro-Russian politicians and opinion leaders, as before the full-scale invasion, they were the reports of Russian propaganda. And it's very important for us to understand their rhetoric, what are they saying, and whether they have the support of the audience, the same that they had before the full-scale invasion. So We have been closely monitoring before the full-scale invasion their participation in political talk shows where they represented, as they were saying, the opposition, the opposite way of thinking, the alternative way of thinking. That's how usually Russian propaganda tries to call their saying, not disinformation or true lies that they were spreading on national TV, but rather alternative point of view. So there are no political talk shows right now, but the majority of them has their own social media channels where they continue posting Russian disinformation. So what are the key takeaways from monitoring them? So the first one is that they are still active and they are still spreading Russian disinformation in Ukraine. Therefore, at Detector Media, we launched a project called Hall of Shame, where we document precisely all their quotes that they, since the 24th of February, expressed towards the war in Ukraine. And the second takeaway is that the majority of these Russian proxy speakers in Ukraine are now operating in gray zone. So they do understand that the support of Ukrainian people for Ukraine is extremely high right now. So they do not want to lose their audience right at the start. Therefore, they try to avoid naming things as they are. So they mainly do not condemn Russia for the war in Ukraine. They try not to criticize Russia or actually even mention it directly. What they are doing is that they speculate with the various topics that are related to war in Ukraine, but not from the perspective of Russia, but rather from the human perspective. So one of their favorite topics is the evacuation of civilians. So they often speculated with blame the Ukrainian authorities why the civilians were not evacuated beforehand. So there are a lot of criticism, which actually contributes to one of the largest narratives, one of the strongest narratives of Russian disinformation, that Ukraine is a failed state. Another aspect of their disinformation campaign concerns anti-democratic and anti-Western sentiment. And with this regard, they have only amplified their sayings, because before the full-scale invasion, the narrative of external governance was one of the most popular one that these pro-Russian speakers were pushing, and right now they're continuing doing so. So condemning West for starting war in Ukraine, for not enough support, criticizing their actions is again one of the key topics they are pushing right now in Ukraine. And so this is the majority of them, but still there is like a minority of these pro-Russian speakers that continue their rhetoric as they were doing it before the full-scale invasion, meaning that they promote very aggressively that Ukraine is a Nazi state, as again one of the key narratives of Russian disinformation. They also talk about elimination of Ukraine as a sovereign state. So mainly they are transferring the narratives of Russian disinformation that we see on Russian state TV channels and Russia key controlled media outlets. They are transferring them as they are in Ukrainian information environment. So to summarize, these proxy speakers, the pro-Russian politicians and opinion leaders are still active in Ukraine. So they may seem less dangerous right now, as a lot of them are not openly support Russia and openly urge to support Russia. but they spread very toxic things that undermine Ukrainians' belief to political leadership that we have right now, Ukrainian belief into democracy, into partnership, and into the democratic world order in general.
Thank you for watching the episode of the special project Ukrainian Flames delivered to you by Ukraine Crisis Media Center, Ukraine Catholic University's Analytical Center, and NGO Euro-Atlantic Course. If you find our job useful, please like and share this video and subscribe to our channel to stay tuned. In the description to this video, you can find information on how you personally can help Ukraine in the face of the Russian aggression. Remember that everything is going to be Ukraine.